Hey YouTube, excited to share this piece of content with you. I had a chat with Jonah. Jonah is based in the United States. He's worked extensively in the NFL and is well versed in all things neuromuscular testing, force plates, and so on. And he had some questions about the metabolic side of things, the conditioning side of things. So we talked about many different things, especially on the tech side. We talked about Moxie, lactate, VO2 master, how to apply those different technologies, the limitations of said technologies in the context of testing, what I've been using, and then some other thoughts on respiratory training and I guess conditioning in general. So here you go, without any further ado, my conversation with Jonah. You got in touch with me via email a few days ago.
Yep.
And we have some common interests, and I thought it would be good to not waste quote unquote a conversation and maybe share it with the world and see what everybody thinks. Maybe get the ball moving forward. So here we are.
Sure.
So where do you want to start? I know there was multiple things that we wanted to talk about. So where do you want to start?
Yeah, there's definitely a few things I want to I've been listening to a few of your talks on your YouTube page and things like that. Anyway, just a bit like my background is mostly in American team sports. So I guess that's where a lot of my interests lie for applying some of this methodology. Where
what did you, maybe that's a good place to start. Maybe give a bit of background of yourself. You gave me a couple lines via email, but trace your history quickly so we kind of know where we can head with it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, so Jonah, originally from New York City, always very interested in like exercise, physiology, but also a bit of like a data science background. So got into sports science, studied economics and physiology in undergrad. And then I actually got my master's degree at University of Texas, Austin under Dr. Ed Coyle, who's like pretty well known in the metabolic space for his literature surrounding like determinants of running performance. When I was there, we would the lab was working on like Wingate testing, so just different protocols for testing anaerobic performance. So I before that, historically, I was like very involved in like neuromuscular testing, and like that's like where the American bias in sport lies, I would say. Like we're very heavy on like force plates and all these explosive sports like strength training, all those things, and we kind of ignore like a lot of like the energy production side or metabolic side. And so Dr. Coyle got me really interested in that side because that's kind of what his background was in. And the reason I went to UT Austin was because I was pursuing a graduate assistantship and I was the sports scientist with the basketball team while I was there. Then from working under Dr. Coyle, I kind of realized that we were missing like a huge gap in a lot of like the typical American sports performance testing because we were so focused on just that neuromuscular side, and we're really missing out on a lot of the other physiological systems that contribute to neuromuscular performance, but also just contribute modalities that happen in those sports. So anyway, from there, I went to work for a professional soccer team in America, Austin FC, who was just starting up as in the sports science realm, which is really cool. And a pretty big metabolic component in European football or American soccer. So that's very interesting to me as well. And then from there, I was able to get connected with some NBA teams and stuff and be with a lot of their performance staffs in the area. So I was fortunate enough to work with some of them. And then from there, got actually a full-time position in the NFL where I was for the past few seasons in the Houston Texans. And that was like very interesting too, because again, it was a very neuromuscular emphasis in regards to the testing stuff. And a lot of people thought that was the way it should be just because of the nature of the sport, where it's like very short duration, explosive plays, and then you rest and then you repeat. But even that being said, I thought there was a lack of emphasis or a lack of understanding of the importance of the metabolics that go into that and some of the energy system stuff. And there's no really any testing around it. So that's when I became more and more interested, I would say, about how do we apply this stuff to some of these like short duration, high intensity sports that occur in America, because I still think it's important. And since then, I've moved on and doing my own thing right now, but also at the same time, like I'm still working with some athletes. So I thought that some of the tech you guys were utilizing was really interesting because I've been exposed to it a little bit, like the Moxie, some of the Spiratory, all that stuff, but haven't really been able to experiment with it enough, I would say. And at the same time, I've started to work with like some more endurance runners because I enjoy running myself. And so just thinking about how all the different applications of some of the tech. So anyway, the reason I reached out to you is I had seen a lot of your stuff in regards to like applying this to just a variety of athletes. And I thought it was just very interesting how you were using like Moxie, VO2 Master, some of this other tech um, to get like a whole picture of the athlete and maybe where their strengths and limits lie. Because I know I felt really confident doing that from like a neuromuscular standpoint with like a lot of my background in force plates, like motion capture, all that stuff, like sprint profiling. And
Yeah.
I definitely knew like I needed to work on some applying some of this other tech. So that's kind of why I've just been reaching out to people who I think from reading their stuff, I've done a really good job and was kind of just curious about learning more.
That's awesome, man. It's interesting to have that perspective because I'm not currently dealing in any, um, I guess North American sports. If we talk
Yeah.
NBA and NFL and other ones, I'm very much in CrossFit and endurance sports, and even in on the MMA side a little bit. So it's interesting to hear that the force bias, I guess, or neuromuscular bias that you
Yeah.
were mentioning here. It makes total sense. It makes total sense, and it makes me smile in the sense that there's probably so much to do in terms of
Yeah.
work and benefit for everybody. And so I guess maybe one place to start, or maybe my perspective on what you just said, would be that the way I'm treating the testing now is from a very general standpoint. So the GPP component I feel has
Yeah.
been vastly overlooked for the last few years, and it's probably a pendulum swing thing where we've been a lot into all the hit protocols and win gates and how effective they can be. But and it's funny, I just commented on there's an account on Instagram called WOD Science, some guys based out of Switzerland up in
Oh yeah.
Zurich, and they post about different research papers and studies either around CrossFit or stuff that's applicable to CrossFit. And they just published a meta-analysis where they were reviewing the effectiveness of hit training versus moderate intensity continuous training on different, I think it was on VO2 max on different populations. And obviously the benefit is higher on the hit side. And that's something that I've seen across the board. I mean, that all studies
Yeah.
say that, but then my comment was, I'm 100% in line with this. The question then becomes, in an applied context, how many blocks of training or how many cycles of hit training can you do in a row before you blow a gasket?
Yeah, but
Because
that's what I mean. It's like those classic principles of periodization and like just
yeah,
good training. It's like, yeah, like a high intensity stimulus is a lot of times probably going to be more potent, but at the same time, like how long can you apply that high intensity stimulus before you start getting negative adaptations, or you get hurt and then you can't be consistent with your training. And
yeah,
I think like you alluded to, something I've seen historically too is like sometimes VO2 max is it the best predictor in like certain events, obviously like longer distance stuff.
mm,
So which has been interesting too. Yeah, the reason actually a few weeks ago I was at a conference in Boston, MIT Sports Analytics Conference, and Olav Alexander Boo was presenting, and I
nice.
read a bit of his stuff, and yeah, he just blew my mind. Essentially, for lack of a better term, when he was talking about stuff, I was just like, okay, I got to talk to this guy, and then it just so happened we were staying in the same hotel, and then it was like the next morning at 6 a.m. we were both working out, and we just sat there and talked for like an hour or so. And then I was just like, he was talking about like how he was applying this stuff and it resonated with how you were doing it. I was like, oh man, these guys are doing something cool. I feel like, because it just felt like if you could combine this tech, like then we started talking about force plates and
Yeah,
accelerometers, which was like a lot of my background. So I
yeah,
was like, okay, like I feel pretty confident with evaluating neuromuscularity. And then like what you were saying, if you can get just like a whole general picture or like a GPP picture of the athlete
yeah.
via like that tech, but also some of the other tech you guys have been exposed to, I think it would be really interesting.
Yeah, and maybe to continue on that, and I'd be interested to hear from your standpoint where Olav and my lines of thinking kind of connect, because I obviously only see my stuff from my own perspective, and sometimes it's
Yeah.
hard to have that outside perspective. So I'd be curious if you don't mind giving me a couple lines afterwards on that.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
on the tech you were mentioning, I think, and that's kind of having I started, I guess, from the wrong end, if some people might say, of the spectrum when it comes to what tech I started using when testing. I
Yeah.
discovered all this, the bioenergetics side of things, through, or I rediscovered, I should say, through Evan Pycon, who was heavy in CrossFit before, works for a biotech company now. They're actually coming out with a device incessantly now. It should be now. It should have been 2 months ago, but they're a bit late on the release. And I know they've worked with some top teams in the NFL recently as well, so we can talk about that after.
Yeah,
Something
that's
close to the
fascinating.
Moxie, actually, that kind of builds on
Oh,
that
cool.
technology and goes a
So
bit
just
beyond that even.
like another near infrared spectrometry kind of near stuff.
it's
Interesting.
it's it has nears, but the main, I guess we could talk about the main thing that they're going to be, and I'm just speaking from what I've seen. I don't
Yeah.
have any insiders, information or whatever. So if I say stuff that's not accurate, I'm sorry. It's called the NOx, NOxX,
Okay.
and they have a huge emphasis on nitric oxide.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was funny. My graduate degree, like it was a very like metabolic based degree because that's what the lab at UT does. And like there was so much talk about nitric oxide. I was
yeah,
like, man, what is this thing? Why does this matter? Why does everyone keep talking about it? Just like, and then we'd go for like vasodilation, all this stuff that it does in
yes.
the body. It's like, okay, now I'm starting to understand why this one little chemical they all care about so much kind of matters. But I've never seen anyone try to measure that before.
So apparently they can measure it quite well, and I've seen a couple pieces of information from that. It very much looks like it has an inverse trend to SMO2 from I guess a muscle or
Yeah.
SMO2. I'm fucking losing my language right now.
No, physiologically, it makes sense if you think about like the vasodilation principle and
Yeah,
SMO2, like that
and
relationship.
essentially, at least what I understand, I might be off on that. On the Moxie trend or on any SMO2 trend, TSI for other devices, when you see a plateau in the severe domain, which to
Yeah.
me means that you've exceeded your maximal oxygen delivery capacity.
There's like no O2 left to, right.
You're just using more than you can bring, right?
Yeah,
And you
yeah,
can't bring any more than that. And that's
yeah.
and the way that I connect the dots with that second threshold, so to speak, is some of the physiological determinants of critical power. One of the
Yeah.
biggest ones being, if I'm not mistaken, it's the number of capillary contacts around type
Yeah.
1 fibers.
That was Dr. Coyo's research.
Oh, here you go. And
Yeah,
I
yeah,
actually
exactly.
I actually have a screenshot of that segment of the paper in most of my presentations.
Yeah, yeah,
And
that's funny.
the idea being, at least the way I understand it, is that that critical power being highly correlated with essentially your maximum oxygen delivery
Yeah,
capacity.
exactly.
And once you cannot deliver anymore, but you keep consuming more, right? Then there's that discrepancy between delivery and utilization, and now you trend towards VO2 max and towards failure.
Yeah,
And so the idea being is that when you get to zero or nadir on the SMO2 trend, now you've exceeded your maximum delivery capacity. So you're starting to eat up your W prime, and you're going to quickly trend towards failure. And it seems like NO has a reverse tendency where it's going to increase. And when you get to second threshold, it's going to plateau because you've maxed out your vasodilated capacity, you've maxed out your oxygen delivery capacity, and you can't go any further than that. That's at least how I understand it currently. I don't know if
so it's almost just like another intensity regulator where you can like help determine live like like training zones, thresholds. Like,
yes,
interesting.
yes.
I would be curious to see about like the reliability of it compared to just like typical SMO2 monitoring, if at
Yeah, and
all.
apparently the resolution is super high. I think it's 50 hertz, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, that kind of device, that's because what's Moxie sample at? Like just
two,
two, yeah.
two.
Wow.
Yeah,
Interesting.
and from what I've heard, the price point is going to be less than half of a Moxie at this point. And so
Sounds interesting.
and they haven't they've actually launched the campaign is up, as in you can sign up to be on the wait list for when they release it publicly.
Oh, cool.
And I've chatted with Evan a few times, and he said that they've been essentially working with special operations and with NFL teams so far. So
Interesting.
I'm
Because I'm pretty well connected with a lot of these NFL teams now. Like most of them, I would say. I haven't
yeah,
heard anyone who's been experimenting with it, so I'll
okay.
definitely have to hear more.
Yeah, I don't, like I said, I don't have any insider information. That's what
Oh, I
I've
mean,
heard so far.
it sounds fascinating, like
It
you said.
does.
I
It
mean,
does. And
I
so
think,
that was
yeah,
my long way of saying that this is kind of where I started, is with the Moxie, because I discovered it through Evan. And so
yeah,
I dove into that. And I was like, geez, this is fascinating. So I just went down the rabbit hole, still haven't come out of it,
yeah,
happily so. And then from the Moxie, I found the VO2 Master. And
yep,
then only as a third step, I went kind of back, quote unquote, to lactate. And
yeah.
now I use all of them. And I do think that at this point, if I had to pick one, I would still pick lactate, which is funny
Interesting.
because there's a lot of people that say that,
Can I
it's,
ask you why
yeah,
so? What's your rationale?
it's at this point in time, it seems to me to be the most accessible and the most easily applicable field test, or just test that you can put in place.
Yeah,
I would point to the limitations of the different devices that I use. And I think this is why when I do a full test, I use all of them, because I
Yeah.
feel like by combining them, I can minimize the impact of each device's limitation, so to speak. So obviously lactate, and I'll start with that because I think it's good to strongman the argument by, you know, seeing the reverse position first. The lactate is going to be influenced by many internal and external factors,
Yeah.
such as hydration, nutrition,
Exactly.
fatigue, and then temperature.
Yeah.
There's many different factors that, you know, nutritional status on the day, even on the minute.
Yeah.
If you have a very long test, you might have some glycogen depletion factors that come into account. I mean, there's so many different things that can play into that. Then there's the reliability of the device itself. There's, from what I understand, a plus minus 0.3 millimole kind of confidence interval, even though honestly, from all the testing that I've done, I've been able to get, I think the sampling is really at the center of things. If you don't sample properly, you're going to get a lot of
Yeah, I was
errors.
gonna say because it's so prone to like sweat, like all that stuff getting within the sample, right? Like those are things.
If you don't do it perfectly, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I've been doing a lot of them recently, and it's very rare that I have to take a second sample because my trend looks like it should look, quote unquote. So
Yeah.
I rarely get anything that's really outside the bounds. So yes, we have to account for the device's margin of error plus minus 0.3, which is fairly significant. And
Yeah.
then there's obviously going to be differences from one device to the next. I've seen comparisons between them. So depending on what device you use, you might not get the same result as another one. As always, in that context, I always say that you need to use the same tools in the same protocol to compare results. Otherwise, you might as well be comparing apples to oranges.
Yeah.
So that's lactate, and obviously, so the sampling is probably the biggest one. And then there's also, and that I haven't been able to test, but I know Olav talks about, you know, whether you sample at the finger, at the ear, you might get some differences. So then there's a duration of the steps, what protocol you use. There's so many factors. So that's all the downside of lactate, of using lactate. But then I'll go to the downsides of using a metabolic analyzer like VO2 Master, which is a great device. Full disclosure, I'm affiliated with VO2 Master and with Moxie, so everybody knows. But I do love their products, so I have no problem talking about it positively. They're not paying me to say that it's a good product. Let's say that in this way. VO2 Master, it's a great piece of kit. It's super easy to use. You put it on, it takes 2 minutes to calibrate, and then you can see ventilation and VO2 in real time, extract the data really quickly, and then I can work that into my reports for the athletes that I work with. And then you got the Moxie, but I guess back to VO2 Master, the downside of using such a piece of kit, it's still a lot more involved, so to speak, than even though lactate is invasive and you have to prick, it's still, for me, it's still a lot easier to show up with my lactate analyzer in my little box with my cotton swabs and all that stuff than to show up with my whole VO2 Master kit. And it's still faster to apply. The person can literally jump on the bike and I can start the test right then and there. And I rarely get any issues with the VO2 Master, but obviously sometimes if it's really cold outside, then you get humidity accumulation. The sensor doesn't like it. So if my tests are pretty long, so you might get to percentages of humidity that trigger the warning signal, because you don't want the sensor to be too humid. It's going to have a negative impact on it. So that's a limiting factor. Again, my tests are very long, and when I'm doing 2 or 3 tests or maybe 4 tests back to back, sometimes it hasn't had time to fully dry before the following test. So in the context of what I'm doing, sometimes that becomes a limitation. From a reliability standpoint, I haven't had an issue. When I have had issues in the past, they've solved it really quickly by sending me a replacement device or fixing the problem, helping me through some even some software updates. So that was all fine, but it's still more involved than a lactate test. And then finally the Moxie, to keep them going on the limitations of the device or of the technology. It's not the device itself, it's more the application of the technology that is currently limited, because the interpretation is really not that straightforward. And even after having done I think I've probably done upwards of 150 tests with the exact same protocol using the Moxie, and often using 3 to 4 Moxies at a time on the person, I can see general trends but I still can't. If you only gave me the Moxie trend, my confidence interval would be much, much less than it when it is combined to the other metrics,
Yeah.
because you still sometimes see stuff that is not the same as always.
Yeah.
And I still cannot explain it.
Well, yeah,
Um,
to me, like, especially like I've had a similar experience where like if you only, again, like based on my own biases, if you're only looking through one piece of technology, you're discrediting like the complexity of human physiology, right? And there's so many
yeah,
different factors based on the day, based on where that person is, that can affect that outcome, that you're not gonna have. You don't have an X-ray vision to see what's actually physiologically going on.
yeah,
So I know historically for me, like it becomes a lot more powerful when you combine different information streams or different
yeah,
pieces of technology to kind of get a better story of what's going on from the whole picture,
100%.
from the whole standpoint.
Yeah, that I agree with that. And again, that's why when I can, I combine everything. But if I had to pick one,
Yeah,
I
it'll
would
be
still
lactate.
currently pick lactate. And it's despite all its limitations, I feel like it has stood the test of time. And
Yeah,
you do see, obviously, there's many ways. Again, there's as many ways to use it as there are coaches, in my opinion, because then you get to, okay, what's the right protocol for lactate testing?
yeah,
And you can ask all the experts, and you can find a lot of the, and I'm not saying that pejoratively, you can find a lot of those experts on Twitter, and they'll voluntarily share what they know. And I've learned actually a lot from many researchers and
yeah,
coaches on Twitter, and it's been great. But you can literally put up a thread on what is the best, protocol for, and you can give a very specific situation, because if you're too broad, they're going to say, well, it depends on the context, what's the athlete, what's the
yeah,
blah blah blah. You can give a very, very specific context, and you'll literally have as many protocols as there will be comments on your tweet. So there's still no consensus. There's obviously general guidelines. Longer steps are probably better.
yeah,
Under 3 minutes is too short. All those kind of considerations, but in general, there's still no consensus. So I think the difficulty is just finding a framework that works for you. And so that's kind of what I've done from the beginning for myself, is I've stuck to that I call it protocol 41 now, but it's a modification of the Moxie 515
yep,
protocol. And essentially the way I got to it is that I started with the 515 because I started using Moxie and this is what they were promoting. So I just picked it up because I didn't know any better. And then through my own research, I found that, hey, you know what? 515 is great, but maybe I don't get as good a resolution on an hour test as if I only do one step at each power output.
yeah,
That way, that doubles my resolution in terms of granularity of the results. So that's
yeah,
interesting. Now, 5.1 is good, but it gets to an hour 5, an hour 10 for most of the people that I test, which are CrossFitters, which are not endurance trains, which have a hard time to already do an hour of easy cycling. Doing a full test for an hour and a half is just too much for them.
yeah,
So that's why I kind of went back to, and I kept the minutes of rest initially, because you can see the reoxygenation curve on the Moxie, which I find really interesting.
yeah,
And you get that same inverse
yeah,
relationship where you're going to peak out on your reoxy slope once you reach critical power or you
yeah,
pass your second threshold, because again, maximum delivery capacity, so
yep,
maximum reoxygenation. That makes sense. So I kept those minutes of rest. And then when I added lactate later down the road, well, that 1 minute gave me a nice, easy time frame to
to
take my
collect your last,
sample. If I had
yeah,
to take a second one, I had ample time. And I also look at, even though I don't necessarily use it per se, but it's nice to look at trends for the same athlete over time, look at heart rate
yeah,
recovery during the minute of rest. So
yeah,
I kind of standardized that protocol, and it's not mine. I just kind of, that's my best compromise, let's say. And I've stuck to it from the beginning, and I've found that to be very useful.
yeah. So let me ask you based off of that. So I have a few questions. Do you always do it on a bike? Is my first question.
No,
Okay.
I'll most often do it on a bike. And the other, the times I won't do it on a bike is, say I'm testing rowers
Yep.
and they know how to row, I'll test them on a rower.
Yeah.
A
Oh,
CrossFitter that already rows really well from a technical standpoint and wants to specifically target the development on the rower, I will
okay.
test on the rower. But most of them don't have the technical proficiency
Yeah.
to justify even that. I treat in CrossFit, a little aside, in CrossFit, I treat the ski erg and the rower like we should treat weightlifting, which is as a technical skill
Yep.
first and foremost. So essentially develop physiology on the bike and on the run, and then you transfer that into technical proficiency on the rower and the ski erg. And
Yep.
obviously, once you reach a certain level of proficiency, you're going to do some specific work on those machines. But until then, just work on moving better, because you'll save 20, 30, 40 watts off the bat. Whereas gaining 40 watts from a physiological standpoint will take a year or two.
Yeah.
So no, I don't always test. So the rowers, if somebody's very proficient and we need to develop that specifically, if I test runners or triathletes, obviously we're going to test the run as well.
Yep.
I usually test CrossFitters on the air runner, because that's what they'll find in competitions. I'll usually test triathletes and runners on a motorized treadmill, because they're usually more comfortable with it. So that's how I usually operate. And then, other than that, if it's for general purposes, I'm heavily biased towards the bike, because of its low technical demand,
Yep.
virtually zero technical demand, zero impact, ease of modulating intensity.
Yeah.
There's so many advantages to working your general conditioning on it. So that's why I do a lot of it on the bike, but not necessarily all of it.
Yeah. And then I guess this is more of like a hypothetical question based on this, because as you alluded to, you've worked with a lot of CrossFit athletes, and obviously like there's different metabolic demands for CrossFit athletes, and there's a high intensity component. Yep. So if you're working with, like, for example, an athlete who operates a lot in this high intensity space, recovery space, like what would your ideal testing protocol be besides what you alluded to? Is that all the tech that you would have? Or if you had, like, if money wasn't, and like, if you could buy whatever you wanted, like what other tech would you put on, and what else would you test? Like what other testing would happen?
That's a good question. I would get a physio flow.
Okay.
Yeah, which allows you to see cardiac output and
Yep.
those central parameters a little bit better. Not a little bit better, just allow you to get that info. Because if you don't have, and I think it's 15 to 20K, so that's well out of my wheelhouse for now.
Yeah.
But if I could, then I would add that, because it's a bit like with VO2 Master, you get the frequency and the tidal volume of breathing.
Yeah.
And heart rate is the same, right? You have and you know that you got frequency and then you got volume, but we don't see that volume component. But actually being able to quantify cardiac output in different athletes, that would be the dream. And I'll hopefully get there to the point where I can justify getting that piece of kit and adding it to my whole, picture. I'm already starting, obviously, with all the tests that I've done, to getting a pretty good idea of what the physiology of an elite performer in CrossFit looks like, or what are the prerequisites to kind of be within the best in terms of what your metabolic profile is going to be like. But having that info on top of it, I mean, that's just the nerd in me that wants to get that piece of information.
So,
and also quantify progress, because when you see, for example, I have some bike programs that are mainly geared towards CrossFitters. And what I get them to do, because those are programs that they run on their own. I'm not there, so I don't test them before and after unless they decide to come and see me for it. I get them to do an hour at a given power output on the bike steady and measure their average heart rate. And I get them to do the same in week 12 and then compare what heart rate is at for, say, 120 watts. And it's usually going to be 80% of threshold 1. So it's in the moderate intensity domain. It's easy work. It should be nice and linear on the heart rate trend. And I don't know, and I won't know until I have a physio flow. I don't know if it's because they've increased their capillary density. So
what's actually the reason?
Is it the capillary density? Is it the left ventricle hypertrophy? Is it something else? Is it a combination? I don't know. So I'd like to know those things, but right now I can't.
So typically, like with that associated power output, you'll just see lower heart rates after the 12 weeks.
Yeah, it's typically 5 to 15 beats lower for a given power output, simply by, and my program is nothing. It's a very basic endurance program, essentially, right? You get a vast majority of low intensity training, comfortably below LT1. And if I don't have LT1 measured, I'll
so you just provide power outputs essentially to determine.
Yeah, what I do is I get them to do on the Endure program, which is the more long endurance focused one, which is actually the one that works the best with CrossFitters. I get them to do a 20-minute test. Mm-hmm. And then I'll take 90% of the 20 minutes as the second threshold estimation. Yep. And then I'll take I think it's a pretty conservative percentage, 55 or 60% of that as my zone 2, zone 3 transition. So my first threshold, which is usually...
You'll keep them in a moderate domain like you were alluding to, yeah.
Exactly. And I'm probably keeping them a little bit farther down than if they had done a lactate test. but
Yeah.
on a program that anybody can do, I'd rather them be too low than too high.
Yeah. So like,
Because
this just out of my own curiosity, like in an
yeah,
ideal scenario, if they were with you and you had them with you, would you also throw a moxie on them just to make sure that they're not like, that they have very high levels of like SMO2? Why
well,
they're doing
the
that?
thing is, did you see my video that I did with Jem on the SMO2 trends?
Yeah, I saw like the two different,
Yeah,
like you
yeah,
have the hyperbolic, and then you also have the ones who are just like whatever, like the different phenotyping. Because like phenotyping is actually something that I've been really fascinated by recently,
yeah,
because like, especially in the NFL, you deal with like a lot of variety in athletes.
yeah.
And regardless, like you have like these really fast twitch, like explosive wide receivers. Like everyone's extremely explosive and powerful, but you see variability.
Mhm.
And it was really interesting where like you would see these guys who were like so extremely fast twitch, so powerful, and they would just like kept getting hurt. It was kind of interesting. And then there's been some interesting research coming out recently about like phenotyping with like when they're using the MRI machines to
Yeah.
determine creatine levels. Actually, Olav and I were talking about that one a bit, because I think it's really interesting too, where like, hey, like if we see some of these guys who are mostly fast twitch predominant with some of these new MRI techniques that are less invasive than biopsies, and like they were seeing injury rates and stuff, just the way like the muscle interacts with the tendon. I think that stuff's all really fascinating too. And then how Jem was like in your video alluding to like, hey, like, can we also see like this just total holistic picture of a
Yeah.
phenotypic going from a different SMO2 profile? Because obviously like type 1 and type 2 fibers, again, that's probably an oversimplification of fiber type, but are they going to process like metabolically differently as well?
Yeah, and that's something that I guess I don't have the adipose tissue layer data on all
Mhm.
the athletes that I test. So, and I know that's according to Jem at least, and that's from my experience, that's what I've seen as well. It's going to be a big influencing factor on what SMO2 trend you see, and
Yeah,
ultimately what absolute numbers they display. So it's not necessarily the SMO2 number itself that's going to tell me anything. It's how the trend behaves across the intensity spectrum,
yep,
and it's cross-referencing how I would interpret how I would interpret my lactate threshold 1 versus what
yeah.
the Moxie shows me, and is the shift in I guess trend in the SMO2 coinciding with where I would actually interpret my lactate threshold 1 and
Like
then lactate
where
threshold
the
2.
delayed slope starts actually like going down, or like if it's neutral
Exactly.
going
So
up.
usually on the parabolic profile, and for those who don't have those references, go watch the video with Jem that we did. Jem Arnold, who's a friend and colleague that works with NIRS, amongst other technology and testing cyclists, and mostly cyclists. On the parabolic profile in the moderate domain, you would see an increase in SMO2 trend during the work stages. Once you've passed that first threshold, what you'd usually see is a bit more of a
Yeah,
dig, and then it would kind of flatten
now
out.
we'll look out. Yep.
And then in the severe domain, it would start to pull down.
Yeah.
Whereas with the linear profile, you would see more of a flat in the moderate domain. It
And
would
then it's
be
just
a
gonna go down.
decreasing in the heavy domain, and then flat again at the nadir in the severe domain.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I would try to look at in parallel with the lactate data. And again, there's as many ways to interpret a threshold as there are methods to interpret a threshold.
Yeah, I think I
Uh,
listened to a podcast you have when him and Andrew Sellers were talking about thresholds and all that.
Yeah, we did one like
Like,
that. That was a good one. So the the method I've settled on currently is the baseline plus 0.5, but with a twist, because the original baseline plus 0.5 is that you take your resting lactate as the baseline. And then whenever your active lactate, let's call it, goes 0.5 above, that's
yeah,
where you put your threshold. The problem with that is, again and again, I've measured people at 1.5, 2 millimoles at rest, and
I
you
was gonna
get
say
them, it
resting
goes
last.
down. It goes
Yeah,
down, right? Obviously, because obviously that makes sense. And so now you're actually, I find that you're overestimating that first threshold by using that resting value. So what I do is I use the minimum value that I see during an active stage as my
okay,
reference point, and then from there I take the 0.5.
yeah,
If I were to use longer steps than 4 minutes, I might actually allow for a bit more,
yeah,
right? Because there would be that time delay and probably a bit more accumulation on the lactate side. But I'm happy, given that my work stages are pretty short. 4 is pretty short in the grand scheme of things for lactate, and so I'm pretty happy with a conservative interpretation, because that way I'm not just going too far. If I were to take plus 1 millimole from the minimum lactate that's displayed during the early work stages, I feel like that wouldn't be appropriate given my current protocol. So again, I've even invented, quote unquote, my own way of interpreting lactate threshold 1. It doesn't actually exist on paper. It hasn't been studied. It
Yeah.
just, that's what kind of makes sense. And maybe it doesn't for others, but I think, again, finding what protocol works for you and what methods work for you consistently will allow you to make better decisions than just taking something out the box and say, well, that's been peer reviewed, so that's must work, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely for sure. I mean, that's all really fascinating parts. I guess something then that comes to mind next for me is do you do any kind of like neuromuscular testing with any of the athletes or
Not currently.
not
And
currently?
that's probably something that I might explore down the road. I'm definitely heavily involved in all things conditioning now from many standpoints. Like I said, CrossFit, endurance sports, triathlon. I'm working with a couple guys that are sailors that are
Oh,
doing
wow.
the have you heard of Sail GP?
I have. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
So they're two guys on the Swiss team, Julien and Jeremy. And so they cycle with their arms essentially. And
Wow.
Julien can push more watts on 20 minutes with his arms than most people can with their legs.
Fascinating. Just like the potential adaptations that people can get based on the like based on like the demands of their sport, right?
That,
Which is
yeah, there's that, and now there's exploring with them on an individual basis. How much do we have to do on the grinder, which is the machine they use with their
yeah,
arms, on the arm crank? How much can we do on the bike to elicit central
some of these
adaptations?
central adaptations that hopefully just go with the
Yeah,
overall sport.
so I'd be fascinated to explore other testing technologies and aspects of it. I just currently don't have the bandwidth to do so, and
Yeah.
I feel like I still have so many things to explore and learn within conditioning itself that pulling away from it, that's at least not what I want to do currently. But I'm interested in learning
Yeah,
more.
it
Yeah,
makes sense because I guess just based on like my own background, like obviously working in the team sport, you get so many injuries, right? There's so many people with
yeah,
historical injuries, and obviously that could be a precursor for asymmetry, or there could be other reasons for asymmetry just based on the demands of their sport. There may be
yeah.
typically overusing one side versus the other. So you see a lot of these asymmetries pop up on force plates like EMG, short EMG, stuff like that we've utilized. So then a question I started to ask myself is like, okay, like a Moxie is able to measure like local O2 kinetics in a muscular sense.
Yeah.
So are you going to see any of these asymmetries pop up in that from like a tissue quality standpoint, ability to pick up oxygen, or can that help you determine if one limb is working harder than the other? And would that connect to some of these neuromuscular testing? Is that a thought you've ever had or something you've ever talked to someone about exploring?
Did you see the paper? They did one in soccer recently where they looked at actually, I think it was they had data on soccer players pre-injury, and then they looked at who got injured during the season, and then looked at their trends after. And I believe that asymmetry in SMO2, and I'm probably
Oh, I think
misquoting
what's
it.
his on his YouTube channel, Andre, did he go over it?
Andrew Feldman. Yeah.
And
He did look at that. He did look at that. So that's the only case I have in mind, and that would make sense to me from a theoretical standpoint. But then the question always is, what are we actually measuring with the Moxie, right?
yeah,
There's a proportion of myoglobin, there's a proportion of hemoglobin. We don't know what is what. And locally, depending on where you apply the sensor, it's local. It's very much under where the light is pointing.
I was gonna say it's only a very small portion of that total tissue.
So until you get a sleeve that is gonna 3D, I guess, or get your render 3D of everything that's going in the muscle on the whole length of it, and at every square millimeter of it, I I I can see it making sense, but then it's way above my pay grade to even think about how that could be applied in a practical sense. But it
Yeah.
seems like people are looking into it, and who do I forget who it was, but somebody who's in seeped in research and who told me that they found the results interesting, although they didn't like the methods that were applied in the paper, and how they were interpreted, but that the results were interesting for future research. That's kind of the gist that I got out of it. But again, that's research is I read papers, but I'm not scientifically trained in that regard. So I extract what I can, but I'm very much a layman from that standpoint.
Well, yeah, and it makes a lot of sense. I guess something I found is there definitely still is a bit of a disconnect between some of this like laboratory based setting and applying it in the real world, obviously, because there's a lot of logistical constraints
Yeah,
What
that's another one.
sport that you can't account for in the laboratory, or the laboratory is just going to ignore. And so like how you apply this stuff practically can be totally different, I've realized.
And that's another reason why, the accessibility of a lactate analyzer currently is still much more accessible than even getting a Moxie or a VO2
Yeah.
Master. And so at the end of the day, I'm lucky to have all of them. But for people that want to dive down into those areas and maybe don't have an unlimited budget, I think it's interesting to always consider the logistics and the accessibility of the tech,
Yeah.
because if it can help more people, then in my opinion, it's going to probably be better, even if it's maybe slightly less accurate or it has more downsides or blah,
Well,
blah,
that's the
blah.
thing. A lot of times, like just weighing that balance between practicality and validity, right, is something that we
Yeah.
need to think about. Like, it's not always going to be 100% valid in the field, and you just have to accept that and understand like the standard error rates and
Yeah,
knowledge
exactly.
those when you interpret the data, which I think gets lost on people. Like, we're not going to operate in a perfect world, and you just have to accept that with a lot of this stuff.
And that's probably different in a research context because you
Yeah.
have much higher constraints, but then it's a budget that goes with
Yeah.
it.
And you
And
need to, so you could determine
you
what you're actually seeing.
exactly. But then if I had to choose between having a perfect measure that's virtually inaccessible to 99.9% of people versus something that's flawed, but that can help a lot of people be more intelligent with their training, I'd rather go with option two. Because again, we gotta,
Yeah.
at the end of the day, the research is interesting, but if it has no transfer to the field, then we need to find that transfer. Obviously, we need both sides. We need the research, we need the applied side, and I guess for me, I'm very interested in the research, but I'm a lot more on the applied side than on the research side. So I
Yeah.
tend to skew my thinking towards that.
Yeah. So have you typically seen, you mentioned like gems, different SMO2 curves. Is that
Yeah,
something that you've seen across a multitude of your testing platforms where like there's these two separate profiles
yeah,
emerging? And that's
yeah.
not only showing up on the Moxie, but it's showing up on like VO2 Master, like lactate. Is this just something that you've seen across different technologies?
No, that's definitely specific to the Moxie because of the penetration depth of the signal and how adipose tissue thickness is going to influence essentially what depth of the muscle you're sampling.
Okay, yeah.
And the way that we figured that out in part is that Jem was playing with one of Moxie's competitors, a Train Red.
Yep.
It's a Okay. And they actually measure, or one of their devices measure, because they have different models. I think I haven't used that one yet. They measure at different penetration depths. And Jem was showing me a graph where there was both trends of the more shallow signal and the deeper signal. And they were actually just both the trends that we mentioned before, the parabolic and the linear. They were both on the same graph, and it was the same device. It was the same device at two different depths. And then it kind of eureka moment for me, because I had seen both those different trends, and in the original Moxie information space that I had been going through, the thought process was that if you had more of a parabolic trend, then you were more of a utilization limited athlete, so it's more of
Yeah.
a local thing. And then if you have a linear trend, you're more of a delivery limited athlete.
Yeah.
But then again, that didn't make sense given what I was seeing and all the different people I was testing. And when I just essentially saw those two trends on the same graph, one that was just a shallower sampling point and one was a deeper sampling point, it made sense to me that, hey, it just depends essentially how much adipose tissue you have between the sensor and the muscle. And there's probably other factors at play, but in the case of the Moxie at this point in time, you cannot measure the adipose tissue thickness, and so you cannot normalize or control for that. And so you're going to see those two trends essentially depending on how deep the light goes inside the muscle. And so that is a limitation of the application itself, because how do you normalize for that? At this point,
Yeah,
I haven't
exactly.
found a way of doing
So
that.
you now, essentially what you're saying in the present moment is you are really making decisions based off seeing those two different profiles anymore, kind of like how you used to like be able to determine like a limiting factor.
It's definitely not for me. It just tells me how deep the light goes. That's
Okay.
that
That's all
so
it's telling you.
that's all it's telling me from that standpoint. And then essentially I can't say, oh, now it's trending up, so X, I have to wait until the test is over. Once I have the whole spectrum for that person, now I can say, okay, you're that type of profile. Now I can interpret each segment and say, okay, this is probably moderate, this is probably heavy, this is probably severe.
Okay. So are you still doing, so then a lot of what I'm hearing is like, it's like an intensity control threshold standpoint, like you're able to
Yeah.
determine the threshold. So is there any, because like obviously like you look at a lot of the Moxie blogs and all these things where people talk about like, what's the structural limitation? Is it like a pulmonary limitation? Is it central? Is it like ability to extract O2 at the periphery muscle? So is there anything you're doing then to try to look into that anymore? Or you think it's just way too complex and we're just not at a point where we could determine that yet?
I feel like that model is not the most useful for me to apply. So I don't actually know if it's correct or not, but from what I've seen, and that's a point that Stuart Percival made. He's a guy who works in the UK, does some pretty high level testing on some cyclists. He made a presentation for the Moxie Summit a few years back, and you can actually, I think, go watch it for free
I'll
on
have
the.
to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, so the Moxie Summit, they do it one every year, and
Yeah,
for the last
I've watched some of the videos.
okay, for the last 2 or 3 years, they've been free, so you can
Yeah,
access them openly. And I think Percival or Stuart's presentation is in free access, and he's done some crazy stuff testing with 14 Moxies on the same person. And so what he was saying is that from a general standpoint, the muscle is always going to be the limiting factor, so to speak, and that in any way, even if that is wrong, trying to extrapolate a pulmonary limitation from a local measure on the
very
leg
difficult, right?
doesn't make any sense.
Yeah,
So the way I look at it now, from the respiratory standpoint, because obviously that's also part of the Moxie ecosystem, is looking at the respiratory system and how that functions in relationship with the central cardiovascular and the metabolic system. The way I look at it now is very, very simple. During my testing, I take RPE for general, leg, and breathing. And if the RPE for breathing is always one step ahead of the legs and the rest, and
yeah.
that the person has to stop the test because of their breathing and not because of their legs, and they tell me that, that is a cue for me that, hey, that person probably needs a respiratory training intervention.
Yeah.
So for me, a respiratory limited athlete doesn't show up on the Moxie. It shows up when they tell me my breathing is limiting me in my
So
effort.
will you see that though, like if you're also looking at VO2 master and like you say someone with an RPE, whatever, like that's well ahead of other physiological systems based on what you're collecting, will that show up in like a respiratory frequency thing or anything at a certain threshold or no?
Not necessarily. I find that a lot, and I haven't been using respiratory training for long enough to probably see any meaningful structural adaptations, because that takes months and
Okay.
years.
Yeah.
But what I have seen is over a fairly short stretch of time, probably about 2 months, a month to 2 months, significant improvements in coordination of respiration or of ventilation, I
So
should say.
yeah, like coordination would be more of like a respiratory frequency standpoint then if you could
Frequency and
control.
volume, how they coordinate frequency and volume at different intensities.
Yeah.
I use the Breathe Way Better for that a lot. Again, I'm affiliated with them. I think they're the most accessible and the best device on the market currently to work on that. There are others, and I think they have their place, but the reason I like this one is the feedback that it gives you and the focus on volume, because
Yeah.
you have a lot of those small resistance devices like the AeroFit and other ones
Yeah.
that apply resistance to either the inspiration, the expiration. And I think that has its place in respiratory training, absolutely. But you miss the volume factor. And if you can't continue breathing heavily, let's say, even though you're at rest for extended periods of time, you're going to have a hard time improving that coordination. So how you use your volumes and your frequencies. So kind of just maximizing your volume, and then the frequency is going to match the intensity essentially. And so with people that reported being limited by their breathing in their general practice of their sport and in the test that have done those interventions, I've gotten really, really good feedback on, yeah, so essentially I didn't know how to breathe before, and now I understand how to manipulate my breathing to my advantage, and I don't feel that limitation anymore, and the training helps me with my performance. So that's kind of where I stand on it. Now, whether I'm actually changing the nature of the diaphragm and making it more endurant and all that kind of stuff, I'm not confident enough at this point to even say that I'm changing anything structurally. I think already from the neuromuscular standpoint and the coordination standpoint, there's a lot of interesting work that can be done. So I usually stick to that because I know that people that, you know, have read the research or are well versed in the literature side of things will often retort back that, yeah, but you cannot do anything to, or there's still the old adage that the respiratory system is not a limiter to cardiovascular performance or endurance performance.
Yeah,
And
that's
then
like the
there's,
classic literature. Yeah,
yeah,
like
but you can't
the
change
lungs
that.
yeah, the lungs are overbuilt or whatever. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that was a really good paper by Dempsey, and I gotta revisit that soon. But I from the coordination standpoint, and I think another aspect of the coordination talk on breathing is very interesting, is that the our RPE, our rating of perceived exertion, is highly correlated to our breathing frequency.
Yeah.
So how fast we breathe is going to be highly correlated to how hard it feels, and
Yeah, and a lot of
how
that's gonna like determine like CO2 kinetics, right? And like how what you're feeling in the muscle. I mean, obviously, like we talked about nitric oxide before, like the
yeah.
vasodilator, but then also like CO2's vasodilation principles, like acidity in muscle, like all those things are interesting to think about, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So those are all factors. So yeah, for now on the breathing side, essentially, I don't necessarily measure a respiratory limitation.
Yeah,
It's more going to be something that the person feels,
yeah,
and usually that's going to be improved by training the coordination side of things. Now,
yeah.
I do look at, I do a spirometry test before I do the step test. And so I do take FEV1, so the forced expirated volume in the first second of that spirometry test. I do take that as a baseline and look for 75 to 80% in tidal volume during the dynamic effort.
Okay.
So if somebody has, say, 5 liters on their FEV, so they have maybe 6 or 6.5 liters of lung volume, and their FEV1 is at 5 liters, I'd like them to be moving 4 liters per breath during the test.
Yeah.
Because if they're not, then they're probably breathing faster than they need to. And that alone, if it can help them feel better during the effort, that's a win for me, because perception is reality. So even though it's subjective, it's really the only thing that matters.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. So then based on that, is your main, as of now, like you think the best, like the way I'm hearing you utilize Moxie the most efficiently is from determining like whatever you would say, like critical metabolic rates within that, like the actual muscle, also like zone to determine zones and training modalities. Is that like the main way you would say you're utilizing Moxie at the moment?
Yeah, currently it says
Like the WI model, like determining all that stuff, huh?
yeah, and I don't determine that currently with the Moxie. I've seen some really interesting trends on non-involved muscles above threshold 2, where on trained people you see significant desaturation of the periphery.
Due to
So
like systemic vasoconstriction, you would say, or
that's it might be that. It might, yes, it I think it's I've asked multiple people and I've gotten mixed answers. So for me, the jury's still out. It's either the systemic vasoconstriction or the peripheral vasoconstriction and redirection of blood flow to either respiratory
yeah, like
muscles
the like
or the
redistribution of blood flow, like and like obviously like we were talking about like nitric oxide can have like an effect on that too, and like the
yes,
local so like
yeah.
vasodilation.
But then I guess I got to backtrack a bit for the second hypothesis, because there's on the Moxie there's the SMO2 and there's THB.
Yeah, total hemoglobin. Yeah.
It's supposed to represent total hemoglobin, even though from Roger's own account, which is the CEO of Moxie, and Andrew, who's one of the co-developers, they both say essentially don't pay too much attention to THB because it doesn't actually measure what we thought it measured initially. At least that's what I understood through the conversations that I've had with them.
Okay.
Now, so we got to take that into account. Now, if it does represent to some extent how much hemoglobin is there, what is interesting is when you see that desaturation happen on the Moxie in the non-involved muscle. So I usually do forearm for runners and a
Yeah.
bicep for cyclists or on the bike, and you get some pretty good readings. And on trained people, you see that desaturation in the severe domain, but usually the THB doesn't budge at all. So if we take it from the standpoint that THB doesn't mean anything, quote unquote, then that's fine.
What
But
if it does meet something, and like, would it though be a redistribution of THB away from that non-working muscle?
right. So that's kind of, I don't know. I don't know. Is it the redistribution of blood flow? Is it that, there's also the factor of lactate accumulating systemically
Yeah.
and then could it be lactate oxidation that's driving that trend
Yeah.
downwards in the periphery? That's my hypothesis, but I don't know if it's right.
Yeah, there's just so many possibilities,
Yeah,
huh? All these things are like different signaling, have like different signaling
yeah.
properties. So like, what are they actually, else are they interacting with? It's kind of,
Exactly. So it's a toss up. So no, it's not a toss up. I use it in a few different ways. I use the local measure to cross reference my lactate curve and
yeah.
my ventilatory threshold interpretation.
Yep.
I use the non-evolved muscles to cross reference my second threshold specifically,
Like the
because
threshold
that's
with
usually where you see the change in trend.
yep.
On trained athletes, because untrained people usually can't dig into those reserves,
Yep.
not unlike the trained people. I can actually usually predict when I see that when somebody's going to stop the step test, because once their forearm gets to 0 and they're running,
Yeah.
there's usually nothing in the tank to go again.
Yeah.
So that's just a funny exercise to do. And if you haven't seen it, I put up my Moxie Summit presentation from last year on the
Yeah. I
channel.
watched part of it. I have to finish it.
Okay, there's one slide where I show my SMO2 for 3 and 12-minute tests that I've done on the bike. And I have a bicep, so a non-involved muscle on both. And what's fascinating to me is that this bicep trends exactly like a W prime would. As in, on the 3-minute test, it goes down much, much steeper or much faster. And it actually hits minimum really close to my 3-minute test,
Yeah. Like
to the end of that test, because I've done those tests before. So I know how to pace myself. And then on
Yeah.
the 12-minute test, same thing. It's much nicer slope or longer slope.
It's almost
And
like you can see yourself burning through that battery for,
yeah, so that maybe that's something that's interesting to me down the line to look into in terms of auto-regulating hit training, right? We
Yeah.
know that W prime balance model can be interesting to individualize the volume of training in the severe domain. Well, now if your non-evolved muscle kind of manifests or represents that W prime from a metabolic standpoint, now you could have a Moxie on your forearm when you're running and you do your hit intervals. And when you get to 0, you're
And
done.
it's time for the interval to end. Interesting. Like, so
Oh,
those are
yeah.
like the main ways you would be utilizing Moxie currently.
Currently, that's what I'm looking at. I know that Olav uses it daily with his athletes. And I
Yeah.
think that in that context, it can become a much more potent tool, because now you can start to see trends on the
Well, I was going
day-to-day
to say,
basis.
if you have a larger sample size
Yeah.
with a specific athlete weighing it at the same spot every time, like
Yeah.
it's almost like I've heard some people talk about it from even from like a fatigue management standpoint,
Yeah.
right? Which is what makes sense physiologically, in my
It would.
opinion, obviously. And so like you could like if you wearing it real time, would you use it like you were alluding to, like intensity control even to make sure you're working specifically where you want to?
I think once you have enough data and you
You need
can,
that data.
yeah, once you know what is moderate, what trend is moderate
Yeah.
for you, what value do you,
Especially like if you do it enough with lactate, so you have like a confirmation of it.
so you kind of see it from both ends. And for
Yeah.
Olav, they use it a lot when they go to altitude,
Yeah.
because they'll look at the trends at sea level and then the trends at altitude. And essentially, when your trends at altitude start to look a lot like, and the numbers reflect what you would have seen previously at sea level, then
You've adapted to altitude.
exactly. Yeah.
Oh, that
So
makes a lot of sense.
there's probably some interesting stuff to be done there, in addition to the testing, but currently I'm not able to leverage that aspect of it.
Yeah.
But and again, I think the difficulty is in the individualization. It really has to be on a case by case basis, on a literally a muscle by muscle basis, because if you put it on the vastus lateralis, you'll usually get a linear trend even on people that are pretty lean, right? Because the tissue, the signal goes a little bit deeper, so that's what you see. But then on the same person, you could put it on the rectus femoris if they're running. I'll usually put it on the RF,
The rectus femoris, yeah.
and then you'll usually see a parabolic trend. So is it a fiber type thing?
Or
is
is
it
it just because of adipose tissue? Yeah.
or is it both?
Yeah.
And which one? So yeah, there's still that's kind of all my questions.
Yeah. And then I guess just like the last thing to touch upon, obviously, because some of the things I'm interested in, as I alluded to, is like these high intensity sports where there's a
Yeah.
recovery period.
Yeah.
Like, what are your thoughts on like the Moxie recover, like some of those technology that shows like your local musculature's ability to resaturate O2, like as they're taking a break? Like, do you think there's any value? And like, I know you talked about heart rate recovery too, but do you think
Yeah.
like there's any value in like utilizing any of the Moxie O2 recovery kinetics?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I've heard Evan use it in a hypertrophy context.
Yeah, I've seen that too.
And I find that interesting. And the thought process being that once you cannot desaturate your muscle like you could previously or on previous sets, it probably means you're recruiting other stuff or that you're too tired to keep going. And the question at that point is the extra volume actually useful?
Yeah, are you actually
or not?
targeting the muscle fibers you actually want to target?
So there's probably something there in terms of auto regulation. Now, in terms of local recovery, so the resaturation aspect, the issue with that is it's going to be proportional to the intensity, like we said, because once you get to or go over your second threshold, now you're going to have maxed out your delivery capacity. So you're obviously going to see a very fast trend because of the dynamics of demand and demand and delivery. Now, whether that is the only factor that is important to look at when it comes to recovery, and you say, oh, my VL is fully resaturated, so I can go again. Well, that's negating the central factors, which will have a delay. Just like the muscle is the first thing to go down or to be activated, quote unquote, recruited, obviously, because that's where it starts. And then the heart responds and then the lungs come into play.
You see that delay in like heart rate.
There's that cascade, right? And the cascade goes the other way as well, as in the muscle resaturates first, then heart rate drops,
and your heart rate,
then your breathing goes down. So I don't know if I would only look at this for recovery and in what context that might make sense. I haven't used it in that way. It might be useful in that way, but I haven't had time to explore it enough, probably.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, it all makes a lot of sense just thinking about that.
But then going back to your prior point, what I have seen in all the high intensity sports that I've been dealing with is the lack of GPP and how a lot of the, inability to tolerate the workload and propensity to injury and all of this is usually linked or can usually be tracked back in one way or another to just fundamental endurance. How fit are you from a metabolic standpoint? And I've seen proper monsters from a physical standpoint have the physiology of a sedentary person.
Yeah, and it makes sense. Like the way we started this conversation is like probably because there's such an emphasis, especially in the team sports I've worked in, on like neuromuscular, high velocity, high power training.
Yeah.
Like, and we don't measure the other stuff, so we kind of just ignore it because we can't see the changes that we've like kind of overbuilt those systems. And then like, it's like, oh yeah, like they're performing really well at these very fast velocities, but you don't actually see what's happening under the hood from like a physiological, metabolic, like cost standpoint. And like you said, like you look at like actually glucose levels and some of these other like markers that are actually like, then you do blood work on them or whatever. It's like, oh wow, like maybe you're not as fit as we are fit, for like a lack of better term, as we thought. And like you said, maybe just providing them a little bit of that other stimulus can help a lot from a recovery standpoint. So like if you apply, like, let's say you get one of those guys that you just were talking about, him or her, and you apply some of like these more just like GPB blocks, like I know you said like in the 12 weeks and you'll see like lower submaximal heart rates on these tests. What are you seeing, like other changes in some of the tech via like just lower lactates at the same work outputs, like lower?
Yeah, that's usually what
Moxie, like some Moxie trends too.
Multiple
devices are confirming this.
Yeah, on the test retest that I've been able to do on the people that came to see me for a test, did the program, and then came back for another test. I've seen obviously delayed lactate trends, like you would see. I mean, from a basic endurance
shift in a lactate curve.
Right and downward shift. Yeah, right and downward shift. I've seen a significant change. I have an ultra cyclist. His name is oh Jesus, I forgot his name. He's we've been working together for a year and a half. What's his name? He lives in Annecy, right next door. He comes to see me all the time. He actually listens to the channel. Jesus Christ. I'll try to speak in French because I speak with him in French, so maybe that's why I'm locking on his name. Okay. No, I can't. I can't find his name for the sake of me. I'll put it in the comments because it's bothering me because I know him well. Too many names in my head. Anyway, ultra cyclist in his 60s, has been training for decades, and we did a lactate test last year, or we did a full test, but we had this lactate data, and then he just went and trained well below his first threshold for most of his volume, came back 8 weeks later and had moved his first threshold about 15 watts to the right. And he was about 10 beats lower for a given intensity on the submaximal stuff. And he's a type 1 diabetic, and
Wow.
his insulin intake went down
Like,
40%.
wow.
40% in 8 weeks.
And
Yeah.
did they look at like glucose levels too? I'm sure they were probably more well controlled, but
I guess less reliance on sugar and
yeah.
and just better metabolic profile in general. So that's what I've seen
Probably
on the
flexibility.
Jean-Yves Coupu is his name. Here we go.
Yeah. There you
JY.
go.
So thank God. So that's what I've seen. And then other markers, again, I've got quite a few people that follow my programs that I haven't tested in person, but the consistent feedback that I get, especially from CrossFitters, from MMA athletes, it's just I recover better. I can do more work. My high intensity is of better quality. I recover better between training sessions, during training sessions, inside of a workout when I have to transition from a rower to some rope climbs or whatever. Even within, so it's like macro to micro, just recovery across the board is much better. So
Yeah.
all the way from tolerating the training week from a volume standpoint and intensity standpoint, all the way down to I'm in an intense workout or a workout of the day or a CrossFit test, and I have to go from my deadlift bar to my rower in that 5-second transition. They feel the difference, like consistently feel the difference. I find that pretty fascinating that you can see it on, it's kind of fractal. You could see it at every level.
Yeah. I think it's just funny because it resonates with me a lot based on my experiences. As I said, where it's like, we're so focused, like most of the stimuluses that people give these guys when they are going to do conditioning, at least like I said, in my own bias, it's like a very high intensity interval because it's like, oh no, we have the literature that says like it's going to be just as effective, if not more effective. And it,
yeah, but the cost is not the same. I think that's where the rubber meets the road.
That's where people are like they have that research that talks about like whatever, like the recovery cost like goes up exponentially as soon as you go above power or whatever. Not as soon, but like obviously the threshold is probably a little not as black and white as I just made it seem, but obviously like that there's an exponential recovery cost that goes along with that. So it's interesting that you said that's something you've been going back to recently. It's just that GPP.
Yeah, and in a sport that I guess you could qualify CrossFit as a high intensity sport, right?
Yeah, but I think the same principles apply to a lot of like soccer, football,
100%.
European football. Like I think that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
like I think it applies really well.
It does, and I'm exploring the and I don't know enough people in the space that are doing that, so there's probably others that are applying this. I haven't heard them talk about it, or maybe they're keeping it to themselves. Currently with Claudia, one of the athletes that I'm following, we're working up to close to a couple of weeks ago she was doing 10 hours of just conditioning on different modalities, and that's 1 week, and that's without counting all the CrossFit and weightlifting and strength. She was probably, I think a couple of weeks ago, she was at about 20 hours of total training volume, and about 8 of those were low intensity, just basic low intensity.
Like all moderate domain, as you were alluding, just talking about.
About eight out of 10 in the moderate domain, and then the rest, she had probably a couple high intensity bouts, maybe one on the rower, one on the bike. And that was a pretty intense week. The rest of the time, she would only usually get one intense stimulus on one of the machines.
And is it like a sprint interval session or just a high intensity interval session?
It's going to depend what we're working on. Currently, we had some longer, we had kind of, again, just very basic periodization going from general to specific. So obviously for her, specific is going to be in the 1 to 4 minute time domain on the rower, the skier, and those machines. So working up to that, we started with very general work, started in the moderate and the heavy domain. And then now more recently in more specific phase, we've been more in the severe domain. So more type VO2 max type intervals, 500 meter repeats on the skier, again, the bike is that, or in the rower, because that's kind of a typical session, and that's what they're going to
Like
find in the workouts.
5 minutes or whatever kind of intervals, kind of.
Yeah, those kind of, so again, some extremely basic, everything you find in like a 101 cycling training, you just take that and you apply it to whatever context you're in.
It was funny because like Olaf, when he was speaking, he was just talking about specificity, and he's just like, if you just like look at like the time duration of like what the sport's going to be and change slightly general and get to that, it's like you're going to do okay, which makes a lot of sense. I think we try to get too fancy sometimes.
But I think some of the difficulty is also from a times perspective, at least the way I see it in CrossFit. It's a very time demanding sport. There's so many skills to learn. So it's very easy to say, oh, well, I need to work on all that stuff. And that is actually important for my sport. If I can't do a ring muscle up, I can't compete. So I'm going to do that rather than do low intensity. Plus low intensity doesn't look anything like my sport. So why would I do it?
Yeah.
But where the rubber hits the road for me is that if you can train more in your training week, all things being equal, you're going to be better.
There's no doubt. Like there's literature about volume relating to performance, right? Like if you're able to sustain more volume without getting hurt, like you're probably in a decent spot.
And you see that in triathlon, you see that in biathlon, you see that in weightlifting, you see that in powerlifting. It doesn't matter, across the board, volume, right? And the way I see it is the GPP is obviously helping them train more and better, and that is going to help them perform better.
There's no doubt. Yeah. Recover from stimulus too, so they can train more, like you said.
So I think no matter what the sport is, I think we haven't necessarily explored, unless you're an endurance sport to begin with, we probably haven't looked at the upper limits of how much of that low intensity volume we can justify and actually include in a constructive way, right? It's obviously you can't go from doing none to doing 10 a week. Because from a overload standpoint, progressivity doesn't make any sense. But if you take the time to push those adaptations over months and years, then I'm convinced from what I've seen now that we can have a very positive impact no matter what the sport, because that GPP has just been left out for too long, I guess.
Yeah. No, it all makes a ton of sense. I mean, no, I think you answered a ton of my questions. Obviously, I don't want to like take up too much of your time, but I think it was cool to hear you speak about a lot of those things, a lot of the thoughts that I've been having in regards to like how do you apply some of this metabolic, more of this metabolic conditioning, some of these high intensity athletes, and then what protocols for measuring it. So it's cool to hear how you're trying to apply a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I guess if I had to sum it up in one sentence, is that they're already doing the high intensity in their sport. So that's not what they need in training. Not for me, at least. Right. And if I can bring them the moderate and the heavy domain, it's going to do a world of good to their training and to their recovery. And if that can then allow them to train better and perform better, then so be it.
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, it does. All right, man. Well, that was fun. I had a good time exchanging with you. I hope, like you said, I was able to answer some of your questions, clarify some stuff.
My questions. I appreciate you taking the time for sure.
No, it's fun, and I think again, like I said, we could have done that on the phone. But if some other people can get from that and more people can get fitter, then it's gonna be more fun.
Yeah, hopefully we get to a trend where like some of like these team-based sports are more open to, like, again, because like probably every high level team you go to now, they're gonna have a pair of force plates, they're gonna have like the all that stuff, but are any of them actually gonna have like be collecting lactate or things like this, doing like any of these step protocols? Probably not. So it'd be interesting to see if we can or if that trend changes.
Well, I think once some people buy into it and start applying it consistently and see the results over months, then people start talking and, oh, what are they doing over there? Oh, why are they getting less injuries?
Like just like completely ignoring a physiological, like a key physiological component just because like no one's doing it.
I guess HRV is probably pretty popular in those circles, and looking at, individual recovery day to day. I've seen positive trends on HRV following those types of training blocks.
It makes sense in regards to, like, I've seen some of that with like some of the endurance related stuff too. Obviously, like HRV, like we know, like there's some good literature about it responding to like some of more of those endurance blocks as well, or at least my understanding. But I think that's just like the tip of the iceberg, in my opinion.
It
There's
is.
like a lot more to, again, because like obviously HRV is going to fluctuate and there's all those contextual factors as well. So, but
Yeah.
no, I think it's a great point.
Cool, man. Well, if you want to do another one of those at some point, feel free to email me. It'd be fun to do so.
Yeah.
And yeah, just a chat is always good.
Yeah, I love connecting with just like-minded professionals or people who are trying to push the needle in some of these spaces.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for I guess the conversation and your time, and yeah, stay in touch.
Yeah, I guess just last question for you.
Oh
Obviously, I
yeah,
know
sure.
you've kind of been down. This is more personal. You can
Okay.
report it or not, but I know you've been down this rabbit hole of like trying to learn as much as you can about this stuff. And obviously, like I'm very new to a lot of it in the applied field. And like, what have been the best resources that you found for? I know like putting it into practice is a good one, but more on like the self-education side, wherever you found.
Shameless plug, my podcast.
Okay.
And I say that jokingly, but quite seriously as well. I've been lucky to invite some really big names in the training and especially the endurance world recently. Like you said, I spoke to Olav, I spoke to Steven Seiler, I speak to some other guys of that caliber, and Mark Burnley, Andrew Jones.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get David Bishop on to talk about mitochondria and
his stuff around like mitochondria, like that stuff's really fascinating.
Yeah, so Jem, I cited Jem. I had Nick Jamnik on the podcast, who's written who's authored some really good papers on reviewing different testing protocols and what works and what makes sense. So I've really used that platform to ask the questions to the people that know better, and I found it to be the most valuable resource so far. And then obviously reading their papers and trying to stay out of the entrenched battles of my method is right and this is the only way to go and everybody else is wrong, because you do get quite a bit of this depending on who you fall upon and who you listen to. So trying to stay very removed from those debates or those arguments rather than debates, because they're usually not very constructive, and trying to make my own opinion, taking as many points of information as I can. That's been quite useful.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. All right, I appreciate that. I'll definitely keep listening to the podcast. I'm already a listener, but now you just convinced me even more.
Yeah, go back and listen to those, and then if you don't know which ones to listen to, I'll give you some pointers. But I think it's a good place to learn a couple things.
All right, I appreciate that.
Thanks, Jonah.
Yeah, take care.
You too, man.